Let's go back in time to 1932 as Converse brings you historic footage of the legendary original Celtics with whom all great professional teams are compared.
We have now taken over your radio.
Richie Guerin is about to show you the most important step in getting past a man. It's the first one.
And Oscar will inbound it. The men in green, the Milwaukee Bucks, that's Alcindor against Bellamy.
Henderson has Jordan. Allen shakes, Gray gets two! Gilmore on stop! Oh, brother. Lead Toledo artists, you get 21.
4:28 to go in the first quarter for the Cow Palace. Here's Barry.
Jordan, open, Chicago with the lead!
Hello and welcome back to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I am Jason Mann, and with me as always is Rich Kraetsch, and we are continuing talking about the top 50 NBA player candidates, and our next player we are talking about is Dirk Nowitzki, and our special guest is Kirk Henderson of MavsMoneyball.com. Kirk, welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys.
And the basic case for Dirk is very strong. He is 7th all-time in win shares, 17th in win shares per 48, 37th in box score plus minus, and 19th in value over replacement player. He has one MVP, a finals MVP, 4-time NBA All-First Team, 5-time on the second team, 3rd time on the third team. He has 10 seasons in the top 10 for win shares per 48, 6 times in value over replacement player, 9th all-time in points, 14th in free throw percentage, which for a player of his size is a incredible achievement. Incredible scorer, very innovative in terms of both style and as being an international pioneer. Clearly the best player in Dallas Mavericks franchise history. Kirk, talk a little bit about Dirk.
It's pretty strange because Dirk is probably the player, and he's been in my life longer than anyone that's not my wife or my parents. He's been in the league for 17 years now. Which is just really kind of incredible when you think about how he started out, because he was he felt like such a reach for his first year. I remember being, young in Dallas, and they ran, the Dallas Morning News ran side-by-side comparisons of his and Paul Pierce's stats the entire first year, which was just, it wasn't even a contest because Paul Pierce was just so much better right out of the gate than Dirk. But, as his game, evolved and the way Don Nelson really kind of molded him, he became such a pioneer player. I kind of argue that he's obviously not the best player from that group of guys drafted in the late 90s, but really his position and how he played the game really forced the rest of the NBA to change. There had been such a thing as a stretch four before Dirk, but I think that you could make the argument that he has been the most impactful stretch four of recent history.
Yeah, I'm right with you there. I mean, I made no questions on this podcast. He's absolutely my favorite player of all time. Even living in Chicago, even growing up in the Jordan era, there's no question Dirk is my guy. I mean, he's the guy that the minute I saw him, I said, wow, this guy is amazing because he was so different, because he was, as you said, you didn't see that. I mean, 7-footers didn't shoot, there was a few guys here and there, but for the most part, this guy was a 7-footer who was more comfortable being at the three-point line. It wasn't like he had that as a part of his game. Like, no, that was, one of his primary parts, but then also he could go down low. He could bang. He could just do so many things on the floor that it amazed me, and I felt like I hadn't seen anybody do it as well as he did. And then just to see how his career progressed, because this is like 1999, 2000, where I said, whoa, this guy's really awesome. And then to see his career evolve and change and become, leader of a title team, get so close the one year and the criticisms about him, at least in my mind, unfair criticism about, oh, he's not a winner and this sort of stuff. And then to see him finally achieve the title and all that sort of stuff. But I'm right with you in terms of the influence when we look at a Dirk Nowitzki for this purpose and for the purposes of, this top 50 or whatever. Influence is a big part of what we're doing. And I find it hard to not say that he's a big reason why we see the NBA we see today. And it might be a little, hyperbolic or whatever, but I just feel like he is that important. And that could be my bias. I don't know if, Jason, you feel the same way. Kirk, you seem to feel like you seem the same way, is that I think he's one of the more important players of our era and our generation. And I don't think I'm overstating that.
Go ahead, Kirk.
Well, I think that it's in terms of the late 90s talents, there are some guys that simply aren't, you can't replicate what they did or do in the case of like Kobe Bryant, Kevin Garnett, and Tim Duncan. They were such supremely talented athletes and skill-setted players that what they did doesn't come along that often. In terms of what Dirk produced as a stretch four, we've seen like a series of reasonable facsimiles the last 15 years. They might not have been as good as him, but they really did help change how teams were built. And I think that he at least really pushed the trend forward in terms of how that relates to the NBA's like top 50 players of recent years. I think that has to matter, at least in the conversation.
Yeah, and I think we've kind of alluded to this, but I mean, he really like made it like acceptable for a big guy to shoot threes and play out in the perimeter, and made that into a winning strategy. There were guys who did it, but he was the first to make it, to make it a strategy that could win a championship. I don't think there's anybody else, no one that I can think of, of his size and his skill. And really, there's almost no one who at his size had his skill. He not only changed what was, acceptable in the game, but he made like that a winning strategy. I mean, and it's part of the revolution that, 7 seconds or less is part of that. What Golden State is doing now is part of that. It is sort of changing, challenging basketball orthodoxy and making it, a different, more open, more exciting game.
The other thing that I really found interesting, at least looking at his career as a whole, is he's had three distinct kind of career arcs. He had the initial Don Nelson grouping of years where he was, probably the third wheel of the Steve Nash, Michael Finley, Dirk Big Three. He wasn't the best player of that group. And he, was just basically asked to score and grab some rebounds. He certainly wasn't asked to do too much. When those guys left, Avery Johnson was the one who kind of forced him to become a mid-post back-to-the-basket player. I think the thing that's very interesting looking at his statistics is his MVP season. He hardly shot any threes comparative to where he's gone both before and after Avery left Dallas. And since, pretty much the 2011 title season and going into now, he reverted back into much more of a jump shooting player. But it's so interesting. You look at his numbers from year to year, and they're remarkably consistent despite the fact that he's played such different styles.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And the other thing, too, that I look at as well is, and talk about the remarkable consistency, is look at the guys that he did it around and the people that have just shuffled in and out of that team. And, like, talk about a guy like, a Tim Duncan, who's somebody we've talked about a lot, and he's been able to have remarkable consistency, both in coaches and roster and that sort of stuff. Yeah, there's a few guys here and there. My God, I mean, look at the amount of guys that Dirk has played with, and amount of coaches and systems and all that sort of stuff. Yet you look at his stats and you would think, yeah, this guy had, the most stable system, but it's not that way. I mean, the guy, and you said he's been asked to do different things in different eras with different coaches and different players, and it's just remarkable how consistent he's been through all of that, which I think is no small task. I think it's really, really important when we talk about him and his case for being a top 50 greatest of all time.
Yeah, and I kind of think, he was one of 5 players that we picked, post-1996 players that we decided were absolutely no-brainers, had to be on the list, weren't really, didn't need to debate them or anything. And he, is the other ones are Kobe, Duncan, Garnett, and LeBron. But of those guys, I would say he is probably the last one I would kind of put into that category, and maybe that's because defense is a bit of a weakness for him, and to a lesser extent rebounding. Kirk, how do you feel about him as a defender? Do you feel like, he was good enough at it to pass by? Do you think it was more of a weakness in his game, but, just his brilliance on the other end overshadowed it? Or, how do you kind of feel about that?
I think in his early to mid career, he ended up being a passable defender. He was a decent help defender, because one thing that gets forgotten about Dirk, and I think is going to be a problem as we move away from his career, is Dirk was remarkably athletic and quick for a guy his size, which just hasn't been the case for so many Euros who've come over since. So that helped him defensively, but he was still a little bit of a saloon door at times. To this day, I still don't understand how he doesn't get called for a foul every time he rakes guys across the arms who go to the basket. You know that move I'm talking about? Like, he sticks his hands up every time he gets called for it, and he's like, what's happening? And every time I see it, I know that the hand is, or your hand is part of the ball, but just like on television, it looks like such a clear foul. And, as a Mavs fan, I'm always happy with it, but I could always hear, opposing fan bases just get so upset that he was never called for that. So I think that you do have to kind of, I think him being the last person on that list makes a lot of sense. I do think that where you would rank him in the top 50 gets very interesting, because on the one hand, you're correct that I think that he has to be included in the top 50 discussion regardless, but you could really rank him anywhere in, probably from, 6 to 8 all the way to maybe in the mid 30s, because his game is, he never really he had such a strong career series of years, but in comparison to, a Duncan, a Garnett, a Kevin Durant, there's not been that one overwhelmingly dominating year. I was pleased to see him win the MVP, but I think the case could be made that he really shouldn't have won it back in 2006 or 7, excuse me.
Yeah, real quick, we've been doing these through all these podcasts, is looking at the advanced stats. And one thing that was very interesting about him, and it was kind of it's one of the things that you can kind of run into sometimes by looking, merely at advanced stats. And I think for Dirk's, it's especially a problem because Basketball Reference, when you look at him and you try to, I initially went forward/center. That's what I would kind of consider Dirk. Well, they consider him just strictly a forward in that. So when you look at him strictly as a forward, then it becomes kind of tough because, his rebounding numbers stand out, and you look at this guy and you go, whoa, he's a dominant rebounder, merely looking at the stats. But then you look at his shooting and go, oh, this guy's not a very good shooter, which is that's not what anybody would think, because they'll kind of put him in the same pocket with small forwards. So, he's not the same shooter as, Jason Capono, but he's obviously a great shooter for his size or whatever. So it's kind of funny. So I try to finagle it a little bit, but I thought this was, at least, we'll just kind of lay this out right here real quick, is how Basketball Reference kind of puts, era and position and how he sort of ranks there. Looking at era and position, so looking at, forwards of his era, he's third in win shares per 48, third in value over replacement player, does really well in that. 61st in effective field goal percentage, 100th in field goal percentage, 126th in rebounds per 36, which, that there's always going to be that issue. And that's a guy who's not always, banging and not always right there at the basket. So that'll hurt a little bit. And third in points per 36. So solid. But you look at those shooting numbers and you kind of go, that's not great. But then you kind of also realize when you're looking at small forwards as well, it's kind of tough. So that always becomes a problem. Position all time. Dirk, he's 12th all time in points per 36, 319th in rebounds per 36 amongst his position, 26th in 3-point. That's not Dirk, so that's fine. We want 26th in 3-point percentage, 99th in effective field goal percentage, 6th in value over replacement player, and 6th in win shares per 48. So even though some of those stats don't really jump out, because I think of how they sort of classify him, and I think but the problem is, how do you classify Dirk? It's so different, and that's where we kind of start out this podcast of, when you look at guys of past eras, there's really not many guys you can say. I mean, there's a guy we've talked about, Jason and I, a few podcasts ago, about a guy like Ralph Sampson, who had a very similar skill set to Dirk, but at the time was criticized for being soft, and why aren't you going down low, and he's injury prone and all that sort of stuff. So eventually that's just kind of, he lost that part of his game, and it wasn't really what he probably would be best at, whereas Dirk was able to do that and thrive in that. So it's hard to get comps there, but I thought that was a pretty good way to kind of, a little snapshot of how he compares with forwards. But I don't know if I would call him a forward. I don't know if I'd call him a center. He's a tweener. I mean, that's what we know about Dirk. He's that stretch forward that now will be so much easier to kind of look back on, but, trying to do this in purposes of how we're doing it in all time, it's hard to classify him. I don't know how you classify him.
I think the further we get away from his career after he retires, it's going to be really hard to contextualize his impact because, teams have figured out in a hurry that you simply, like, building around a player like him, or I think a player like Kevin Love, who is so good offensively but really lacking defensively, is impossible with the pace and space era that we're playing in now. And so I think it's going to be very interesting to see how people view Dirk, because he just is such an odd player. He's obviously, as I've mentioned, I think he's revolutionary, but it's hard to really explain how he was revolutionary looking at stats. I mean, you can see some like basic box score stuff and say, okay, he did some pretty interesting things. Because to me, like, one of my favorite things is that, throughout 17 years of play, he still managed to average, something like 24 points and 10 rebounds a game in playoff games, which is just stupid for a guy who's 36 years old and has played that many games. But, that's not the sort of thing people are going to look at when they're talking about statistical impact. They're going to go back to what you're referencing, and it's going to be a little odd. I think he's still going to get his due, but I think over the long haul, he's going to eventually slip into that underrated category, which feels weird to say right now.
Yeah, I feel like Rick Barry might be a decent kind of comparison in terms of like kind of a guy who is a little bit forgotten, although it'll be for different reasons. Rick Barry just wasn't, was not very likable, and didn't really play for the glamour teams and so forth. But I do think, like, if you think of like Dirk as like a bigger evolution in that type of player, kind of was the same type of scorer, even I think a better shooter than Barry, and also had kind of the similar situation of putting a team that people didn't have that much expectation for on his back and taking them to a championship in sort of an odd year against a juggernaut of a team. Like, I think there's sort of that there, which I think does help a little bit in the how people remember Dirk and in the legacy of Dirk, because he has that he has that outperformed Wade and LeBron in the finals thing, which not a lot of guys have that on their notch. So I think I think it's going to help him kind of be remembered, although I agree with your larger point.
Yeah, it's pretty funny that the dirty little secret of that 2011 finals is, as brilliant as Dirk played, Sean Stevenson shot 50% from three over 6 games. So that may have been a little bit of a point. So,
Rich, anything else that you have to add?
Not really. I mean, the biggest thing that you look at a few of the weaknesses, because we want to kind of do that. And I think the tweener position is going to be an interesting thing of how we sort of contextualize that as we go through. I think he's absolutely a top 50 candidate and absolutely a top 50. I would put him, of course, a little biased, but I think I would put him in the top 50. I don't think there's much of an argument either. I think he's a pretty well no-brainer. There is the tweener stuff that's going to kind of hurt him, and how do you sort of classify him? But then we also add the influence there, and I think he's super important influence. And I mentioned that a few minutes ago, is that I just think he's one of the most influential players of this era. And I hope that, like Kirk said, we don't, 20 years from now, he's underrated and people have to say, no, he was really incredible. And like, no, he was one of the first to do this, and that. I hope we don't have to do that, but I feel like we are, though we shouldn't. I mean, he's there, and he's absolutely just an important figure in this era and in NBA history, I think. And I think it'd be a crime to not have him on your top 50. And I think I'd be shocked if we do not. And I think he's pretty much a no-brainer for us, even if he's out of that, top realm and the no doubters, but I think he's right there. I would put him in and be absolutely criminal to not have him in. I think he's top 30 even. I would really go on record saying that. Absolutely.
Yeah, he's a no doubter for me. Absolutely. He's in. And there's nothing at this point that you could say to take him out of there.
That's pretty much the case with me too. I would be interested if we're to select kind of a grouping of our peers. You take 100 people who write and watch a lot of basketball and see where you would rank a player like Dirk. I really think you would get numbers that were all over the map, just for the various reasons that we've talked about. I mean, for me, I'd put him in the top 20, but I could see arguments for further back, or I could see arguments for higher up.
Yeah, I have friends in conversations, and I've always been a huge Dirk supporter. I still have friends today that I talk, and they're like, "Yeah, he's okay, but he's not like as I think." Of course, I said he was like an all-time great. I still have buddies who are smart basketball fans that still kind of are like, "No, I don't know. He's okay, and this and this and one, And it's pretty funny because, like you said, I do think that if you did that poll, he'd be all over the place. I think his standard deviation would be all. I mean, it'd be crazy because I think there are some that think he's like you and I and a few other people that think he's top 20, top 30, and then there's probably people that would say, low end top 50, maybe out of the top 50. But yeah, he's a very interesting case in that sense where I think he's a no doubter, but I could see why people would have some doubts about him.
Yeah.
Well, you can feel free to edit this, but I just had to share this. So whenever I'm getting into an argument with somebody about Dirk in comparison, I point them to let me see here. It's the 2002 Western Conference first round where the Mavs played the Wolves. Kevin Garnett in 3 games posted 24, 19, 5 with 2 steals and 2 blocks. So that's just a crazy stat line. Dirk countered him with 33 points, 16 rebounds, 1 assist, 3 steals, and 1.5 blocks. So it's just kind of one of those things where, like, when he was at his peak, he was an absolutely dominant player. But the problem is that he was just never, like, so overwhelmingly dominant in a way like a Garnett and a Duncan were, except for, that 20-game stretch to kind of head into the playoffs in 2011.
Yeah. By the way, he is 55th on the Slam Top 500 players. Which I saw somebody complaining about that on Twitter the other day.
That is pretty criminally low for. At least I would put him there. Yeah,
it's low. I agree. I mean, but that does show. I think it demonstrates sort of the range of feelings that people have for him. But yeah. So Kirk, is there anything that you would like to mention to our listeners?
No. I think we all need to be hoping that Dallas has a good year because if not, I really fear Dirk could retire at the end of this season. It's kind of a low-key concern. I feel that he's the kind of player, even though he's 30, I think he's 37 now, I feel like he could play 3 more years at a very 15 to 20 minute a night kind of pace as a 6-man off the bench for a decent team. But I think that if he has another bad year like he had in 2012, 2013, he might decide that he just wants to walk away, which would be very disappointing for all of us because he really is a fun player for people who really love basketball.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm worried about, the idea of losing, him and Garnett and Kobe and Duncan all, in the same year or two. I mean, that's a lot to lose. And obviously Kobe and Garnett are, pretty much shells of what they were. But, you never know. Maybe Kobe could make one more run, but it would be sad to have him go out, like in a John Havlicek situation in on an awful team or other guys who have Elvin Hayes who have kind of gone off on later than they should have. But yeah, hopefully the Mavs are fun at least this year, and I think that's not out of the realm of possibility. I don't know about how good they're going to be, but fun, and Dirk still being a relevant player, I think is an achievable goal.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me on, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks, everyone, for checking us out, of course. We are at hardwoodparoxysm.com and part of the HP Basketball Network. You can find the HP Basketball Network on iTunes. It would be great if you left us a rating and a review. You can also find us at over and back NBA.com. That is our new forum where you can find discussions about all the players that we're considering for the top 50, as well as many other interesting subjects. It's a growing forum with a lot of conversation about basketball history. So if you're interested, please check us out. It is very easy to sign up, and I've been told that we are nice people. So so hopefully that is true, and hopefully you will enjoy talking basketball with us. So anything else, Rich?
I think that's it. This is a good project. Moves on, and this is a fun one to do, Dirk. It's my favorite player of all time. But yeah, I'm excited about this project. Got a lot of stuff going on, a lot of players we've knocked out already, and a lot more to go. So it's fun, and we're getting there. Our list is finally getting together, and unfortunately, there's going to be some strong cuts coming up pretty soon, but that's all right.
All right.
For right now, For now, everyone's on, but soon everyone's going to be off. So.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll be back again soon.